Down later in the show. But perhaps the most consequential thing happening right now for all Americans, especially if you're a woman, an immigrant, a person of color, or someone who believes the president should not be above the law, is the battle over Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. Republicans are confident they have the votes to confirm him despite serious questions raised by Democrats in the Senate hearings this week. But my first guest says that he knew Brett Kavanaugh during his years as a Republican operative, and in an op-ed for NBC News Think out yesterday, he writes, "I want to tell any senator who cares about our democracy, vote no." Joining me now, the author of that op-ed, David Brock, founder of Media Matters and chairman of the PAC American Bridge 21st Century. David, thanks so much for being here.
Good to be with you, Joy.
All right, let's start out. I want to play you a little bit of the opening statement from Brett Kavanaugh during his confirmation hearing. Take a listen.
A good judge must be an umpire, a neutral and impartial arbiter who favors no litigant or policy. As Justice Kennedy explained in Texas versus Johnson, one of his greatest opinions, judges do not make decisions to reach a preferred result. Judges make decisions because the law and the Constitution, as we see them, compel the results.
Well, you write in your op-ed for NBC News Think, that's not true, that Brett actually makes a cameo appearance in your memoir of your time in the GOP, Blinded by the Right. You write, "I describe him at a party full of zealous young conservatives gathered to watch President Bill Clinton's 1998 State of the Union address, just weeks after the story of his affair with a White House intern had broken. When the TV camera panned to Hillary Clinton, I saw Brett, at that time a key lieutenant of Ken Starr, the independent counsel investigating various Clinton scandals, mouth the word rhymes with which." Tell me about Brett Kavanaugh. How did you know him, and what was he like? Besides that?
I was part of a small, close circle of young, ambitious conservatives who were being groomed for future jobs in government and politics and media. And Brett Kavanaugh was part of that group. And that's how I knew him. I knew him professionally because at the time I was a conservative myself. He was working for the Starr investigation. I was working on a conservative magazine. We were both part of an anti-Clinton movement. And I also knew him socially, as I described in that anecdote there, where we're all watching the State of the Union and he does mouth that word. So when I saw just that clip you just saw, I mean, I was watching just like everybody else was, and he described himself as a neutral arbiter and stressing his independence and saying he's an umpire. I know he's no umpire. He's straight out of right field.
And tell me about some of the other people who are in that circle, because you write about a group of people, a lot of whom are pretty well known in the media. Who was among the circle that Kavanaugh traveled in?
Sure. So many of them quite prominent today. Alex Azar is the current Health and Human Services Secretary. He was working in the Starr investigation at the time. Barbara Comstock was an investigator on the House committee, really zealously going after the Clintons. She's currently a member of Congress from Virginia. There are media personalities like Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham from Fox. Everyone knows Matt Drudge. This was the circle. And the point here, I think, is that I knew Brett as a partisan warrior. His representation of himself now in black robes is just not who he is. I know who he was, and he was, just like we were, engaged in partisan politics, partisan war. He is, in his bones, a Republican operative, and I think there are a couple things that I point out in this piece that I think show him to be really unfit for this office. One is his role as the kind of the point man for leaking when he was in the Starr investigation, leaking information to the press. Now that's something that a prosecutor doesn't typically do. It's kind of abhorrent behavior for a prosecutor, but they were engaged in a partisan political move against the Clintons in that investigation, so they were strategically leaking. He played a role there. You know, the Vince Foster investigation, Vince Foster committed suicide. He was the White House lawyer. Was a friend of Hillary Clinton's. That investigation was closed by the first special counsel. When Ken Starr took over at Brett Kavanaugh's urging, they reopened that case. They spent a year and a half and millions of dollars terrorizing the Foster family for naught, to conclude again that he had committed suicide and wasted all that time and money on a political smear campaign. And then the third thing is the Paul Jones case. Now, I played a role role originally in bringing Paul Jones to light when I was a conservative journalist, so I was really in the thick of that case. And there were a group of front lawyers for Paul Jones, but then there were a group of lawyers behind the scenes, and we called them the elves. They were doing the real work. And those elves were conservative Federalist Society lawyers, just like Brett was, and I wasn't a lawyer, but I was an honorary member of the Federalist Society, and I was involved in all this. And there was a conduit of information going from the Paul Jones lawsuit folks as they were gathering information and identifying witnesses to the Starr investigation through George Conway, who happens to be Kellyanne Conway's husband, to Brett Kavanaugh. And in that way, the Starr investigation was tipped off to the information from the Paul Jones case, and they used that to set a perjury trap for Bill Clinton.
And I will say that George Conway has responded to that allegation that you made, that they were trying to funnel information from the Jones lawsuit into the Starr investigation. He writes, Brock is a fabulist, and what he says here as far as it involves me is false. In the 90s, I barely knew Kavanaugh, and I never spoke to him again. I never spoke to him when he was working for Starr, let alone about the Jones case. Your response to that?
Well, you know, Joy, I've been speaking out and writing about my experiences in the conservative movement for a number of years now, when I think that I had relevant information, as I think I do now. And nobody's successfully challenged anything I've ever said. George Conway concedes in that tweet that he knew Brett Kavanaugh. I had multiple conversations, Brett, with George Conway about exactly what he was doing, about his attempt to manipulate the Starr investigation with the information he had from the Paul Jones case. And so I know what I know. He has his set of alternative facts.
And lastly, to you, David Brock, you say here that any senator who cares about the country should vote no on Kavanaugh. Is that simply because you believe him to be partisan, or is there something more damning about him that you believe makes him unfit to sit on the Supreme Court?
Well, what I think it is, my piece is not about his views. One can have a debate about what his views are. My piece is about his behavior, and it's about his character. And I think on that basis, behaving as a political partisan while a prosecutor, while he's supposed to be a dispassionate arbiter of facts, acting as a partisan warrior. The same with the Jones case. So I think it's a pattern. I think it shows really poor behavior for what you would want in a Supreme Court justice, and that's why I say vote no.
And do you believe he lied when he claimed that he is just a neutral caller of balls and strikes as a judge?
Yes, he's completely misrepresenting himself. And as you know, as the hearings ended, there was some exposure of other things that he lied about as some of the documents came out from the Bush years. You know, we don't have millions of documents, but some of the emails that did come out show he lied in his first confirmation hearing. So, yeah, there's a pattern there, too.
I'm out of time with you, but I have to really quickly ask you, if you had all this information, why not come forward so you could have the opportunity to testify during those hearings?
Well, you know, when Brett was first nominated, it occurred to me that obviously I had this friendship with him. It really wasn't, Joy, till I saw him up there testifying as the neutral arbiter, as the umpire, as independent, that I got upset about it. And I remembered, and it all came back to me about who he actually was. And that's why I decided to be public this week.
All right. Well, I thank you for your time, David Brock. Appreciate it.
Thank you.